thought my husband was ashamed of me that night. I didn't know he was hiding me because of what I represented. While I stood alone behind a velvet curtain at a luxury party I wasn't supposed to attend, the most powerful man in the room stopped everything, looked straight at me, and said, "I've been searching for you." And in that moment, I realized the life I was living had been built on a lie I never agreed to. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal that crept in quietly, disguised as protection or love, please leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your stories matter more than you know. I never imagined my marriage would reduce me to someone who needed to be hidden. Not concealed for safety, not protected for privacy, but tucked away like an inconvenience. The kind of thing you don't want guests to trip over when they arrive dressed in power and polished smiles. That realization didn't come all at once. It settled into me slowly, like cold air seeping under a closed door, until I couldn't pretend not to feel it anymore. The night of the gala, my husband Ethan barely looked at me as I finished getting ready. He stood by the window of our hotel suite, adjusting his cufflinks, checking his phone every few seconds, his jaw tight in a way I had learned to associate with irritation. Not stress, not nerves, irritation. When I asked him how I looked, he paused too long before saying, "You're fine." Not beautiful, not stunning, just fine. As if I were a document he'd skimmed, not a person he'd chosen. I should have known then that something was wrong, but when you've spent years convincing yourself that compromise is love and silence is maturity, you start ignoring the signals your body sends you. I slipped into the dress he'd insisted I wear, dark, understated, safe. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would make people ask questions. He'd framed it as practicality. "These people are brutal," he'd said earlier that week. "They judge everything." I thought he meant us. I didn't realize he meant me. The gala was being held in a restored art museum downtown, all marble floors and glass ceilings, the kind of place that echoes every footstep so you're constantly aware of your own presence, or at least you're supposed to be. Ethan moved through the crowd like he belonged there, smiling easily, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. I stayed close at first, my hand brushing his arm, until he subtly shifted away. Not enough for anyone else to notice, enough for me to feel it. About 15 minutes in, he leaned down and spoke quietly, his smile never leaving his face. "I need you to wait somewhere more discreet for a bit," he said. I laughed softly, thinking it was a joke, until I saw his eyes. There was no warmth in them, just urgency. Some conversations are sensitive. It's better if you're not visible right now. Visible. The word landed harder than I expected. I wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to remind him that I was his wife, not an intern he could send for coffee. But people were watching, and I had learned the cost of making scenes. He guided me toward a side corridor near the staff entrance, handed me a glass of champagne I didn't want, and told me he'd be back soon. Then he was gone, swallowed by light and laughter. The space I was left in wasn't a room, not really. It was a narrow alcove with heavy curtains separating it from the main hall. I could hear everything, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of expensive conversations, names dropped like currency, deals hinted at, favors remembered. Every sound reminded me that I was close enough to observe, but not close enough to matter. Time stretched in a way it only does when you're waiting for someone who isn't thinking about you. I checked my phone twice, then stopped, embarrassed by my own hope. As I stood there, invisible by design, I started hearing things I wasn't meant to hear. Not secrets exactly, more like attitudes, casual dismissals of people who didn't fit the image, remarks about optics and appearances. Someone joked about keeping liabilities out of the room. Another voice laughed and said, "You can't afford sentiment at this level." I wondered then if that's what I was to Ethan, a liability, a sentimental attachment that complicated the version of himself he was trying to sell. We'd been married 12 years. I'd supported him through layoffs, relocations, long nights where ambition replaced intimacy. I'd told myself that love evolved, that passion settled into partnership. But standing there alone, hidden behind velvet, I felt something crack open that I'd worked very hard to keep sealed. I don't know how long I would have stayed there if the curtain hadn't shifted. At first, I thought it was a waiter. I stepped back instinctively, ready to apologize for being in the way. But when I looked up, the man standing there wasn't wearing a server's uniform. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed with an ease that suggested he didn't need to impress anyone because the room already bent around him. He looked at me for a long moment, not rudely, not dismissively, with recognition, the kind that feels unsettling when you're sure you've never met. The noise from the gala seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat. He smiled, but it wasn't the practiced smile I'd seen all night. It was quiet, intentional. "I've been searching for you," he said. In that moment, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know why his gaze felt like a mirror I hadn't looked into in years. All I knew was that for the first time that night, someone saw me. And whatever he saw, it mattered enough to stop him in his tracks. My first instinct was to look for Ethan, not because I needed his permission, but because I suddenly understood he'd known something I hadn't. The way he'd kept me out of sight, the tension in his voice, the fear disguised as control. This man in front of me wasn't just another executive. He was someone my husband didn't want near me. "I think you should come with me," the man said gently. "There's something you deserve to hear." Before I could answer, the curtain was pulled back further, and the light from the gala spilled into the space where I'd been hiding. Heads turned, conversations paused. I felt exposed and anchored at the same time, caught between the life I'd been shrinking myself to and a truth I hadn't yet learned how to face. And somewhere in that crowd, I saw my husband's smile disappear. The moment our eyes met across the room, I saw something I had never seen on Ethan's face before. Not anger, not annoyance. Fear, raw and unguarded. It flickered there for just a second before he masked it, but it was enough to tell me that whatever was happening was not an accident, and it was not harmless. The man beside me stepped forward, placing himself slightly between me and the crowd, not possessively, but protectively, as if he understood the imbalance of power better than anyone else in that room. People began whispering. I didn't catch words at first, just the shift in energy, like when music stops abruptly and everyone realizes they've been dancing without thinking. Someone said the man's name softly, reverently, and that was when it clicked. This was the CEO, not just of Ethan's company, but of the parent corporation, the one that owned half the city through subsidiaries and influence. I'd seen his face in business magazines, always photographed from flattering angles, always described as visionary, elusive, brilliant. No one had ever described him as kind. Yet the way he looked at me wasn't cold or calculating. It was searching, almost relieved. "I don't want to cause a scene," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," he replied just as softly, "and I promise you the only scene here was created long before tonight." He turned slightly, addressing the nearest cluster of executives without raising his voice. "Please excuse us," he said. "I'll rejoin you shortly." It wasn't a request. People stepped back instinctively, clearing a path as if pulled by an invisible current. I felt my body move before my mind caught up, my heels clicking against marble as he guided me toward a quieter lounge off the main hall. Inside, the noise dropped to a dull murmur. The space smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. He gestured for me to sit, then took the chair opposite me, folding his hands as if grounding himself. Up close, I could see lines around his eyes that suggested years of disappointment carefully managed. My name is Richard Hale, and before you ask, yes, I know who you are. A dozen questions rushed to my tongue, but only one escaped. How? He exhaled slowly. Because 27 years ago, a woman walked away from a negotiation that should have changed her life. She disappeared before paperwork was signed, before names were corrected, before records were finalized. That woman was your mother. The room seemed to tilt. My mother had died when I was in college. She'd been private about her past, vague about her early career. I knew she'd worked in consulting briefly, that she'd been burned by corporate politics, as she liked to say. But this was something else entirely. "I don't understand," I said. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Richard replied. "The deal she walked away from was structured around intellectual property she helped develop. When she left, the credit was reassigned, the equity was frozen, and the beneficiary listed on the original documents," he paused, watching my face carefully, "was her daughter." My chest tightened. "That's not possible." "It is," he said gently, "and it's the reason your husband has spent the last 6 years making sure you stayed exactly where you were." The words felt like a physical blow. Images flashed through my mind, Ethan discouraging me from attending work events, from networking, from using my mother's maiden name professionally. His insistence that I didn't need to work, that it was easier if I focused on us. I thought it was generosity, support. I saw now how neatly it fit into something far less loving. "You're saying Ethan knew?" I whispered. "Yes," Richard said. "He found out shortly after marrying you. He used his access to suppress the file, delay audits, bury references, but he couldn't erase everything. I've been untangling this for years. Tonight was the first time I could be certain." I felt dizzy, my hands cold. "So why now?" "Because the board is finalizing a restructuring, and once it's complete, the window to correct this closes permanently. I needed to see you, to tell you the truth before someone else decided it for you." Silence settled between us, heavy and intimate. I thought of my mother's quiet strength, the way she'd always encouraged me to trust my instincts. I thought of my marriage, of all the small ways I'd been asked to shrink, and suddenly the narrative I'd lived inside for years cracked open, revealing a version of myself I'd never been allowed to meet. "What happens next?" I asked. Richard stood. "That depends on what you want, but first I think you should speak to your husband." When we returned to the main hall, every eye turned toward us. Ethan stood near the bar, his posture rigid, his face carefully neutral. As we approached, he plastered on a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Richard," he said smoothly, "I didn't realize you'd met my wife." "I'm sure, though it's curious given how much effort you've put into keeping her out of sight." Ethan laughed lightly. "I think you're misinterpreting." "No, I'm correcting." The air seemed to thicken. People leaned in, pretending not to listen. I watched Ethan's composure fracture just slightly. "Enough." "Is it true?" I asked him. My voice was calm, almost detached. "Did you know?" For a moment, he looked at me the way he used to before ambition hardened him. Then he looked around the room, and in that pause, I had my answer. "I was protecting us," he said finally. "You don't understand how this world works." "I understand exactly how it works. I just didn't realize you were willing to sacrifice me to survive in it." Richard stepped forward. "This conversation will continue, with legal counsel present, but tonight I suggest you let her decide where she stands." Ethan reached for my arm. I stepped back. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be told what to do. I wasn't hidden, I wasn't small. I was standing in the center of a room that finally knew my name, even if I was still learning it myself. And as the music slowly resumed and conversations restarted, I felt something settle in my chest. Not revenge, not triumph, but clarity. The night wasn't over, my story wasn't finished, but the life I'd been quietly enduring had just ended. I didn't leave the gala immediately. I thought I would. I thought I'd feel the need to escape, to get air, to cry somewhere private where no one could watch my face rearrange itself around a new truth. But instead I stayed, not because I felt strong, but because for the first time in a very long while, I felt entitled to occupy space. The lounge where I'd been hidden earlier now felt like a distant memory, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Ethan disappeared into a group of executives who suddenly seemed less eager to engage him. I noticed the subtle shifts that only come with experience. Bodies angling away, smiles thinning, voices lowering when he approached. Power, I was learning, was a fragile thing when built on a mission. Richard remained nearby, not hovering but present, as if anchoring me to the moment so I wouldn't retreat into old habits. "Would you like to sit?" he asked at one point, gesturing toward a seating area near the windows. "Yes," I said, surprised by how tired I felt. Adrenaline has a way of borrowing energy from tomorrow, and mine had clearly been overdrawn. As we sat, he explained more, careful not to overwhelm me. The equity my mother had been promised wasn't symbolic, it was substantial, enough to make me a stakeholder in decisions that shaped thousands of lives, enough to explain why certain doors had quietly closed in my face over the years, why opportunities evaporated before I could reach them. Ethan hadn't needed to do much, just enough to delay, deflect, and discourage. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, all administered with a smile. "I'm not telling you this to sway you. You have every right to walk away from all of it, but you deserve the choice." The word choice echoed in my mind. I realized how rarely I'd been given one without pressure attached. Even my marriage, once a sanctuary, had become a series of gentle ultimatums framed as practicality. I thought of how often I deferred, how often I told myself it was easier not to argue. Easier, maybe, but costly. Ethan approached us cautiously, his expression composed, his voice low. "Can we talk?" he asked me, not Richard. It was the first respectful thing he'd done all night. I nodded, standing slowly. We moved a few steps away, close enough to be seen, far enough to speak freely. He looked older up close, the confidence he wore like armor now visibly dented. "You blindsided me." I almost laughed. "I hid you behind a curtain," I replied. "I think we're even." "That wasn't what I was doing," he insisted. "I was trying to keep things simple." "For who?" I asked. "For us," he said automatically, then hesitated. "For me." There it was. Not a confession exactly, but an admission. I waited, giving him space to say more, but he didn't. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. "You knew about my mother," I said finally. "You knew what was owed." He nodded once. "I didn't think it would ever come to this." "So you decided for me. You took something that wasn't yours to take." His jaw tightened. "You wouldn't have wanted this, the scrutiny, the pressure. I was sparing you." I looked at him, really looked, and saw how deeply he believed that, how thoroughly he'd convinced himself that control was a form of care. It made me sad in a way anger never could. "You didn't trust me to choose," I said softly, "and that's not love." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he seemed to understand that whatever argument he'd prepared wouldn't land. The version of me he'd built his life around was gone. "I need time. We can fix this." "I need space. And no, we can't fix something that was never honest." I walked back to Richard without waiting for a response. My legs felt steadier with each step. The fear I'd carried for years was being replaced by something quieter, more durable. Resolve. The rest of the evening passed in a strange blur. People approached me, some out of genuine curiosity, others sensing opportunity. I spoke little, listened more. It was fascinating to watch how quickly narratives shifted once a different truth emerged. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was a variable. When I finally left, it was alone. I declined Richard's offer of a car, needing the solitude. The night air was cool, grounding. As I walked, memories surfaced, not painful ones, but clarifying ones. Moments I dismissed as minor now aligned into a pattern I couldn't ignore. At home, the apartment felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to a past version of me. Ethan hadn't returned yet. I packed a small bag, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I needed distance to think, to feel, to grieve what I'd thought my life was. I left a note, brief and honest. I'm safe. I need time. Please respect that. The following weeks were a study in contrast. Lawyers, documents, meetings that confirmed what Richard had told me. My mother's name appearing on files I'd never known existed. Each revelation was both empowering and heartbreaking. She'd carried this quietly, perhaps thinking it was better that way. I wondered what she would say now, seeing me step into something she once walked away from. Ethan called, then texted, then stopped. I didn't block him, I just didn't answer. Silence, I was learning, could be a boundary rather than a punishment. Richard remained professional but kind. He never pushed, he never assumed. He treated me as a person first, not an asset. That mattered more than I could articulate. One afternoon, as I sat reviewing paperwork, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked the same, technically, same face, same hair, but my posture was different, straighter, unapologetic. I realized power didn't come from money or titles alone. It came from being seen and choosing not to disappear. The gala had been a turning point, but not the climax. The real shift was quieter, internal. A decision to stop shrinking, to stop accepting half-truths in exchange for comfort. I didn't know what the future held, whether I'd step fully into the role my mother had unknowingly left me or carve a different path entirely. But for the first time, the uncertainty felt like freedom rather than threat. And that, more than anything else, told me I was finally living my own life. The first night alone was the hardest. Not because I missed Ethan, but because the silence had no one left to answer to. In the past, quiet had always been filled with compromise, television murmuring in the background, unspoken tensions padded by routine. Now there was nothing between me and my thoughts. I lay awake in the guest room of a small furnished apartment I'd rented on short notice, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from my marriage with a clarity that felt almost cruel. In the days that followed, I learned how disorienting it is to step out of a life you didn't realize was narrowing you. Simple decisions felt heavier than they should have. What to eat, when to sleep, who to call. Without Ethan's expectations orbiting every choice, I had to confront how much of myself I'd deferred. It wasn't that he'd controlled every detail, it was that I'd learned to anticipate his preferences and adjust accordingly, mistaking that for harmony. Work became my refuge, though not in the way it once had. Meetings with legal teams and financial advisors filled my calendar, but so did long walks, quiet lunches, moments where I let myself feel the grief I'd postponed. I wasn't just grieving my marriage, I was grieving the woman I might have been if I'd trusted myself sooner. Richard suggested a meeting with the board once things were formally corrected. I agreed, though the idea terrified me. Standing in front of people who wielded influence so casually felt like stepping onto a stage without rehearsal, but I reminded myself that I wasn't there to perform, I was there because I belonged. The boardroom was all glass and steel, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. As I took my seat, I noticed how few women were present. The realization sharpened my resolve. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't over-explain or apologize. I told them who my mother was, what she'd contributed, and what had been taken. I spoke about accountability, not vengeance, about correction, not conquest. When I finished, there was a pause, then nods, not all of them approving, but respectful. Afterwards, Richard pulled me aside. "You did well," he said. "I didn't do it for approval," I replied. He smiled. "I know." Ethan reached out again that evening. This time, his message was longer. He apologized, though the words felt rehearsed, as if borrowed from a script about remorse rather than grown from it. He asked to meet. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because closure doesn't always arrive on its own. We met at a quiet cafe we used to love. The familiarity was unsettling. He looked tired, his ambition finally catching up with him. As we talked, he admitted more than he had before, not everything, but enough. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you'd outgrow me, afraid I'd lose everything I worked for." "So you decided I shouldn't grow at all," I replied. He flinched but didn't argue. That at least was something. "I don't hate you," I told him, "but I can't be married to someone who sees my potential as a threat." He nodded, eyes glassy. We parted without drama, without promises, just a shared understanding that some bridges can't be rebuilt, no matter how carefully you gather the pieces. As weeks turned into months, my life began to take shape in ways I hadn't planned. I accepted a role that allowed me to advocate for ethical restructuring within the company, not as a figurehead, but as an active participant. I insisted on transparency, on mentorship programs, on creating pathways for people whose contributions had been overlooked. Some resisted, some welcomed the change. I learned to navigate both without losing myself. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when the weight of responsibility pressed down hard, but I reminded myself that discomfort wasn't a sign of failure, it was a sign of growth. One afternoon, while sorting through my mother's old belongings, I found a journal I'd never seen before. Inside, she'd written about walking away from the deal, about choosing peace over power, but also about hope. Hope that one day I'd have the choice she hadn't. Reading her words felt like a conversation across time, a quiet affirmation that I was honoring her in my own way. I realized then that the gala wasn't just about exposure, it was about inheritance, not of wealth, but of courage. My mother had taught me, even in absence, that dignity matters, that self-worth isn't granted by rooms full of powerful people, it's claimed. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of completion settle in, not an ending, but a foundation. I didn't know who I'd be a year from now, but I knew who I refused to be again. The woman hidden behind the curtain was gone. In her place stood someone still learning, still healing, but no longer willing to disappear for anyone else's comfort. There's a strange loneliness that comes with reclaiming your life. People don't talk about that part enough. They imagine empowerment as loud and immediate, full of applause and sudden clarity. But most days, it was quiet, purposeful, heavy in a way that required patience rather than celebration. I woke up each morning aware that the decisions I made were finally mine, and that realization carried responsibility I could no longer share or deflect. The company work deepened, not just meetings and strategy sessions, but long conversations with people who'd been sidelined for years, analysts whose reports had been buried, designers whose ideas were borrowed without credit, women who had been labeled difficult for asking questions men were praised for. I listened more than I spoke. Their stories echoed mine in different keys. I wasn't unique. I was simply one of the few whose truth had forced its way into the light. That understanding changed how I moved through the world. I stopped thinking of myself as someone who had been rescued or revealed. I was someone who had survived a slow erasure and chosen not to disappear again. That distinction mattered. Ethan finalized the separation quietly. No public fallout, no dramatic confrontations. I think part of him wanted to preserve the image he'd worked so hard to curate. Another part, I suspect, was ashamed. I didn't press him. Accountability didn't require spectacle. The truth had already done its work. One evening, after a particularly long day, I ran into someone unexpected at a charity event tied to the company's new initiatives. A junior associate I barely remembered from years ago approached me hesitantly. She told me she'd almost quit the firm after being told she lacked executive presence. She stayed, she said, because seeing me step forward made her think maybe presence wasn't about fitting a mold. It was about standing your ground. I excused myself after that conversation and stood alone for a moment, letting it sink in. Influence, I realized, wasn't something you announced. It rippled outward in ways you couldn't always see. Richard and I maintained a respectful distance. He never positioned himself as a savior or mentor. When we spoke, it was as equals navigating a shared responsibility. Over time, a quiet trust developed. Not intimacy, not dependence, just mutual regard. That too felt new. I moved out of the temporary apartment into a place that felt like a reflection of who I was becoming. Light-filled, unpretentious, mine. I chose furniture deliberately, not to impress, but to comfort. I hung one photograph of my mother on the wall, not as a reminder of what was taken, but of what endured. Some nights, I thought about the gala, about the woman standing behind the curtain, listening to laughter she wasn't allowed to join. I didn't judge her. I understood her. She did the best she could with the information she had, but I no longer mistook endurance for virtue. Survival was necessary. Self-abandonment was not. The final legal correction came through late one afternoon. The equity transfer was complete, the record amended, my mother's contribution formally acknowledged. I stared at the document longer than I needed to, absorbing the weight of it. Not because of the value attached, but because truth had finally been written where silence once lived. I took the next day off, walked through the city without an agenda, watched people move through their lives unaware of how much could change in a single evening. I wondered how many others were being hidden in plain sight, told their presence complicated things. I hoped they'd find their moment, their interruption, their voice. That night, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I understood the moral of my story more clearly than ever. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as protection, as love that decides for you, as comfort that costs too much. And healing doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself quietly, consistently, without asking permission. I wasn't the center of the room anymore. I didn't need to be. I had learned that visibility without self-respect is just another kind of hiding. What mattered was that I no longer stepped aside to make myself smaller. The woman my husband hid at the party didn't disappear. She woke up. And that awakening changed everything. Life did not suddenly become easier after everything was settled. In some ways, it became more demanding. There were expectations now, spoken and unspoken, attached to my presence in rooms I had never been allowed to enter before. People watched me more closely, some with admiration, some with calculation. I learned quickly that visibility brings both opportunity and scrutiny, and that neither should be mistaken for belonging. What surprised me most was how often my past tried to pull me back. Old habits resurfaced at inconvenient moments. I caught myself apologizing unnecessarily in meetings, softening statements that didn't need cushioning. Years of minimizing myself didn't dissolve overnight. They lingered in my reflexes, in the way my shoulders tensed when someone challenged me. Healing, I realized, wasn't linear, it was layered. I started seeing a therapist at Richard's quiet suggestion, not because something was wrong with me, but because something significant had happened to me. There was a difference, and acknowledging it felt like another act of self-respect. In those sessions, I spoke about my marriage in ways I never had before, not as a story of villains and victims, but as a study in gradual surrender. How love, when paired with fear, can slowly convince you that less is enough. One afternoon, the therapist asked me a question that stayed with me. When was the first time you remember choosing silence to keep the peace? The answer came too quickly. I was 24, newly married, declining a job offer because it conflicted with Ethan's schedule. I'd told myself it was temporary, practical, sensible. I hadn't known then how many temporary sacrifices could add up to a permanent loss of self. Work continued to evolve. I spearheaded a review committee to audit legacy contracts, focusing on transparency and credit attribution. It wasn't glamorous work. It was meticulous, sometimes tedious, but it mattered. Each correction felt like a small restoration, not just of policy, but of dignity. Some executives resisted quietly, others pushed back openly. I learned not to internalize their discomfort. Change rarely feels polite to those who benefit from the status quo. Ethan faded from my daily thoughts, though not entirely. Occasionally, a memory would surface uninvited, a shared joke, a quiet Sunday morning. I allowed those memories their place without romanticizing them. Love had existed. That didn't negate the harm. Holding both truths felt like maturity rather than bitterness. One evening, I attended a smaller gathering hosted by the company for emerging leaders. No gala, no spectacle, just conversation. A young man approached me afterward and said he'd never seen someone talk about power without apologizing for having it. I smiled, not because I felt powerful, but because I felt honest. That felt like enough. Richard announced his retirement plans not long after. The news rippled through the organization, prompting speculation and unease. He asked to meet privately before it became public. Over coffee, he spoke candidly about legacy, about mistakes made and lessons learned too late. Finding you, he said, wasn't just about correcting a file, it was about being reminded why correction matters. I thanked him, not extravagantly, just sincerely. Gratitude, I'd learned, didn't need performance. As his departure approached, I faced a choice: step into a more prominent leadership role or continue working behind the scenes. The old version of me would have defaulted to what felt safer. The current version paused, considered, and asked herself what she actually wanted. The answer surprised me. I wanted visibility, but on my terms. I accepted the role. The announcement came with predictable reactions. Headlines framed my story in simplified arcs. Some called it inspiring, others called it controversial. I stopped reading comments after the first week. Narratives flatten people. I refused to be flattened again. On the anniversary of the gala, I returned to the museum alone. It was open to the public that day, children running across the marble floors, tourists craning their necks at the glass ceiling. I stood near the alcove where I'd once been hidden and felt no bitterness, just distance, like revisiting a childhood home you've outgrown. I closed my eyes and breathed, grounding myself in the present. The woman I was then needed survival. The woman I was now demanded integrity. Both had done their best. As I left the building, sunlight spilled onto the steps, bright and unfiltered. I walked into it without hesitation. The closer I moved toward a life that felt whole, the more I understood how unfinished I had once been. Not broken, not lacking, just unfinished, shaped by other people's expectations instead of my own. That realization softened something in me. It made me less defensive, more open to nuance. I no longer needed every chapter to justify the one before it. Taking on the leadership role altered my daily rhythm. My calendar filled quickly, but my priorities sharpened. I learned the difference between urgency and importance, between being needed and being effective. I stopped equating exhaustion with value. That was a habit I'd inherited from a culture that rewarded burnout as commitment. I refused to carry it forward. There were setbacks. A proposal I championed stalled under political pressure. A mentor I respected withdrew support when my stance became inconvenient. Each moment tested my resolve. The old instinct to retreat whispered seductively, promising peace in exchange for silence. I listened, acknowledged the fear, and moved forward anyway. Courage, I discovered, was not the absence of doubt. It was the decision not to let doubt decide. Outside of work, my life expanded quietly. Friendships deepened, some rekindled, others newly formed. People I'd once kept at arm's length now saw more of me, not because I overshared, but because I no longer hid. Vulnerability, when chosen rather than imposed, felt grounding. I learned that intimacy didn't require shrinking. One afternoon, I received an email from a woman I didn't know. She'd found my story through a professional article and wrote to say she was in a marriage where her ambitions were constantly deferred for the good of the family. She asked how I knew when enough was enough. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. There was no formula I could offer, no dramatic turning point I could prescribe. I wrote back honestly. I told her that I didn't wake up one day certain. I woke up tired, tired of explaining myself, tired of being patient at my own expense, tired of confusing love with permission. And when the cost of staying became greater than the fear of leaving, I listened. I hit send and hoped it would land gently. The work I'd started began to show results. Revised policies passed, a mentorship program launched, quietly, without fanfare, designed to create access rather than headlines. Watching it take shape was deeply satisfying, not because it reflected my success, but because it reduced the likelihood of someone else being erased the way my mother had been. I visited my mother's grave that spring. I brought no speech, no prepared words. I sat on the grass and told her about the things she'd missed, about the gala, about the files, about the choice I'd made not to walk away. I told her I hoped she'd forgive me for stepping into something she'd left behind, and I told her thank you for her restraint, for her courage, for the space she'd unknowingly preserved for me. There were moments when grief surprised me, arriving unannounced in the middle of ordinary days. I let it. Healing didn't mean erasing pain. It meant learning to carry it without letting it steer. Ethan and I crossed paths once more at a mutual acquaintance's event. We exchanged polite conversation, nothing more. He looked at ease in a way he never had when we were married. That told me everything I needed to know. We had both been trying to live lives that didn't fit. Mine had expanded, his had simplified. Neither was wrong, they were just incompatible. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on how much had changed since the night I'd been hidden away. The most profound shift wasn't external, it was internal. I trusted myself now, not because I always made perfect choices, but because I knew I could survive the imperfect ones. On the final day of the year, I stood in my apartment, watching the city prepare for celebration. Lights flickered on, streets buzzing with anticipation. I felt no need to mark the moment dramatically. I poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and breathed. I wasn't waiting to be found anymore. I had already arrived. The new year arrived quietly, without the gala lights or crowded halls that had once defined my life. It came with the ordinary rhythms I learned to embrace, the hum of the city outside my window, the gentle buzz of email notifications that reminded me of responsibility and opportunity, the sound of my own breathing as I sat with a cup of tea in the early morning light. The world hadn't changed. I had, and that made all the difference. I reflected on the journey, The night I had been hidden behind a curtain, invisible to everyone except the eyes that truly mattered. I remembered the weight of the gown, the faint clinking of glasses from the ballroom, the hushed murmurs that labeled me as inconsequential. I remembered the moment Richard Hale found me, his words soft but deliberate. "I've been searching for you." Those words had shattered the illusion that my life belonged to anyone but me, and they had set me on a path I could never have imagined. Since then, every choice had been deliberate. I had reclaimed what was mine, not just in terms of inheritance or corporate responsibility, but in terms of identity. I had learned that being seen by others is only meaningful if you are first seen by yourself. I'd learned to listen to my instincts, to trust my judgment, to honor my feelings even when the world demanded obedience. I'd learned that courage often appears in quiet decisions, not dramatic gestures. The legal matters with the company were now complete. The files bearing my mother's contributions had been restored. Policies were implemented to ensure future integrity. Mentorship programs and initiatives for employees who had been overlooked were underway. Watching these changes take root brought a satisfaction deeper than any applause, because I knew that my actions had created a ripple that might save someone else from the invisibility I had endured. I had grown comfortable in solitude, too. Not loneliness, but a space where I could think, breathe, and simply be. I traveled more. I explored corners of the city I had ignored. I met people whose lives challenged my assumptions and widened my perspective. I discovered pleasures in small things: a quiet morning, a book that captivated me, a meal prepared with care that had once been invisible beneath the constant pressure to accommodate someone else's expectations. And yet, the past never fully left me. Memories of Ethan, of the ways our love had been both real and constraining, surfaced at unexpected moments. I acknowledged them without judgment, understanding that part of moving forward was allowing the past to exist without letting it define me. Forgiveness was a process, not a performance, and it began with accepting that we were both products of choices that now belonged to history. As the months went on, I began to mentor women who faced obstacles similar to those I had experienced. Their stories reminded me of my mother's quiet strength, of the hidden sacrifices we make, and of the resilience that often goes unnoticed. Each conversation, each shared insight strengthened not just them but me. I realized that empowerment grows exponentially when it is shared. I also began to document my journey, privately, not for public recognition, but to preserve the lessons learned. I wrote about fear, about betrayal, about rediscovery. I wrote about courage that didn't roar but whispered. I wrote about the power of being present, of claiming your own life, and of standing in spaces where others once told you you did not belong. One day I knew these words might find their way to others, offering guidance and solace, just as stories of courage once guided me. The gala, the curtain, the discovery, they were now part of my story, but not the sum of it. I had been hidden, yes, but I had emerged. I had been silenced, yes, but I had found my voice. And most importantly, I learned that no one has the right to dictate your presence, your worth, or your future. That lesson stayed with me every morning, every decision, every choice I made. On a particularly crisp evening, I returned to the museum where it all began. The alcove behind the velvet curtain, once a place of concealment, now felt like a monument to transformation. I traced my fingers along the edges of the curtain, imagining the invisible boundary it had once created. I smiled softly, knowing that the woman who had been hidden there was not lost, but awakened. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to step into her own life. As I stood there, watching the city lights flicker through the glass ceiling, I thought of my mother, of Richard, of the countless people whose lives intersected with mine in ways small and monumental. I understood fully that life's true power doesn't reside in wealth or titles or influence, but in the courage to claim your own story and to honor it fully without compromise. I walked away from the museum that night lighter than I had felt in years. I didn't need validation from anyone. I didn't need the applause of the crowd or the acknowledgement of the powerful. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my life, that I had recognized my worth, and that I would never again allow someone else's fear to dictate where I belonged. This is my story, the story of a woman hidden behind a curtain, discovered by someone who saw her, and ultimately awakened by her own courage. I share it with you not to impress, but to remind anyone listening that you deserve to be seen. You deserve to speak. You deserve to live fully and unapologetically. No one else can give you that permission. It already belongs to you. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, please take a moment to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who may be silently waiting to find their own courage. Thank you for listening, for being present, and for allowing the journey of one woman to reflect the potential in us all. The curtain has been drawn back. The room is yours to enter. Step forward.